So very good morning to everyone. Here is another session in the series of ITU TSDSI webinars, and I come from an understanding that the previous sessions have been extremely well received. Today we have another session which is very topical, very relevant, and very important from the consideration of both Indian and global topics that have a lot of traction and a lot of relevant developments. And also on that topic, which is data protection and privacy, we have an extremely well-appointed panel, and we will look through the sessions just very briefly. Yes, now the agenda has come up. So I would like to invite you attendees. Very good morning to you all. Very good morning to the senior panelists. We are going to examine, explore, discuss, and take questions today on the subject of data protection and privacy. I will introduce the panelists as they gain their time, their slot to make their presentations, but I can tell you it's a very well appointed panel today. And just before we start, we would like to run you through some instructions. As attendees, you will be muted to the workshop to allow the proceedings to be conducted smoothly, but you will have the option to ask questions. You can just type them in the questions tab, and there's a person monitoring that. I will keep my eyes open for any alert from the questions tab. The webinar will be recorded and it will be subsequently posted to the TSDSI website. And yes, we will try to keep time. We will start now. We are a few minutes delayed into starting. But if you come back to the agenda, then you will see that we will run this session till 11:45. And in this time, we will invite the panelists to speak there and discuss their advocacies. And just before I start then, I would like to invite a panelist of great eminence. Okuda-san is joining us, and she will help us set the context of this session. And subsequent to that, I will move on to other panelists. About Okuda-san, she is the Regional Director for Asia and Pacific in ITU. So very warm welcome to you, Okuda-san. And she has been appointed as the Regional Director in April 2020. Prior to this, she was the Chief of ICT and Development Section of the ICT and Disaster Risk Reduction Division of the United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Asia and Pacific in Bangkok. That was from 2015 to 2020 before taking on this assignment. She promoted the development of regional broadband connectivity and inclusive broadband through the implementation of the Asia Pacific Information Superhighway initiative. So she has a very large and relevant experience coming into this webinar. And I would like to invite Okuda-san for her brief introductory address. Okuda-san.
Thank you. Mr. Sharat Arora, Chair, SGSS and Co-Chair Outreach Committee, TSDSI, and ex-founder Director, Sensorise Digital Services. Mr. G. Narendra Nash, Joint Secretary, National Security Council Secretariat, and Mr. R. Shakia, Deputy Director General, Satellite and International Relations, Department of Telecommunications, and Ms. Pamela Kumar, Director General, TSDSI, distinguished speakers, presenters, and participants. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone. My name is Atsuko Okuda, the Regional Director of the ITU Regional Office for Asia and the Pacific, as Mr. Arora just introduced. I'm very pleased to be part of this sixth and final session of the webinar series entitled Digital Technology Innovations, Case Studies from India, and the Asia-Pacific region. May I first express my sincere appreciation to the Telecommunications Standards Development Society India for co-organizing this event with ITU, and to the Department of Telecommunications and other government ministries of India for their support in the organization of this webinar series. ITU has been grateful for the fruitful and close collaboration over the past 9 months. Ladies and gentlemen, as new digital innovations are being developed, we must balance the opportunities of big data with the need to ensure data protection and privacy. We know that technologies such as artificial intelligence can have bright and dark sides, including through the unintentional creation of gender and social biases and inappropriate use of data and personal information. Achieving the Sustainable Development Goals and the principle of no one left behind will require a balanced approach, especially with the advent of emerging technologies and new innovative use cases. Today's session is the sixth and final webinar in this digital technology innovation series. The journey so far has highlighted different innovations ranging from connectivity to fintech and 5G to India Stack. Our discussions today will take a step back from the innovations themselves to highlight the importance of data privacy and protection when utilizing new technological solutions. Ladies and gentlemen, ITU is not standing still in this regard. In March, we signed a host country agreement with the Government of India to open a new area office and innovation center in New Delhi. Through the generous support of our Indian counterparts, this office will not only bring ITU closer to our members in South Asia, but also will promote digital innovations throughout the Asia-Pacific region by leveraging best practices from India and the other parts of Asia and the Pacific. The Innovation Center will serve as the vehicle to bring forward lessons learned and good practices from the joint TSDSI ITU webinar series and connect the unconnected among the diverse digital innovation communities and ecosystems. Additionally, ITU is hosting the quadrennial World Telecommunication Development Conference, or WTDC, from 6 to 16 June 2022 in Kigali, Rwanda. As the flagship conference of ITU's development sector, WTDC sets the strategies for the development of telecommunication and ICT with the theme Connecting the Unconnected to Achieve Sustainable Development. Back to back with WTDC, we are also hosting the Generation Connect Youth Summit from 2nd to 4th June. This youth summit will lead to a youth call to action that will capture the vision, priorities, and aspirations of young people across the world for digital transformation. To support WTDC, we have launched the Partner to Connect Digital Coalition. This innovative platform is engaging all stakeholders to mobilize and pledge resources, partnerships, and commitments to foster meaningful connectivity and digital transformation in the hardest to connect communities, with a focus on, but not limited to, least developed countries, landlocked developing countries, and small island developing states. Pledges do not have to be financial, but can also take the form of policy, advocacy, or program. The Partner to Connect Pledge platform is live now. More information can be found in the Handouts section of the webinar tool. I urge all participants and experts in the room today to be part of WTDC, Youth Summit, and Partner to Connect. Ladies and gentlemen, we hope that the session today will not only disseminate knowledge, but also build actions, networks, and next steps towards achieving digital transformation and more inclusive, equitable, and prosperous digital future. But I have to admit that I have mixed feelings about this final session of the webinar series. I'm very proud of our joint achievements and successful collaboration and cooperation with TSDSI and the Department of Telecommunications, with the participation of a wide range of experts and partners. I believe that this webinar series shared promising and exciting innovations and initiatives widely and generated good discussions and ideas while identifying what more we can do. At the same time, I'm sad that this seminar series will end today after building such momentum, networks, partnerships, and connections among all of us. In this regard, we would be delighted to hear from all of you if you are interested in the next steps and what more we can do. At the conclusion of this webinar, a feedback form will be sent to attendees so that you can share with us your views and suggestions to map out and co-create our digital journey. Thank you very much, and I look forward to the stimulating discussions today. Thank you. Back to you, Mr. Arora.
Thank you, Okuda-san, and thank you, ITU, for doing so much in this area. I have been absolutely fascinated with how much ITU gets done in how many different regions. And I think this initiative, both with the DOT and in relation to the many webinars and conferences that Okuda-san has spoken about, is extremely beneficial to the entire community, and we would like to thank ITU for taking these initiatives. Thank you, Okuda-san. I will move on in the session, and I hope that you will get a lot of responses to your questionnaires, because interaction and engagement is the key purpose of this seminar. To the organizers, can you please bring back the agenda?
Sir, we are having a group photo now.
Right now?
Yes, sir.
Okay, very well.
Asif, can you please take the group? And yeah, can we have all the
may I request all speakers to open their webcam?
Morning, everyone.
Yeah, let me check.
You've been holding a smile for a pretty long time now.
That's true. It's good for health, so it's okay.
Yeah, I've taken 2 or 3 photos.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you so much, everyone.
I think the diversity in the background of these various panelists and presenters is also the strength in the diversity of ITU, I guess. All right, so continuing on in our journey in this little webinar, I will now move on to the actual expert talks and presentations. I would like to welcome Mr. Narendra Nath. an extremely high capability officer of the Indian Telecommunication Services who has done an enormous amount of work for both telecoms and security. He is currently the Joint Secretary of the National Security Council Secretariat and has responsibilities for coordination in matters of cybersecurity activities, and that basically governs both the public and private sectors. So Narendranath has been in senior management positions for more than 30 years in the areas of security of communications, communication networks, planning, installation, operations, and maintenance of fixed line, mobile, and data networks, telecom services marketing, business development, and training. I would like to quickly move on to hearing Mr. Narendranath, which is always a pleasure, on his views today on data privacy and protection. And to the audience, I'll tell you, you can't have a better speaker at this time than him on the subject that we are discussing. So without much ado, Mr. Narendranath, I'd like you to take your time to please present your views.
Yeah, setting the timer. Yeah, good morning, everybody, and I think some of the participants, if they've joined from somewhere else, early good morning to them and good evening also. So thank you very much for this opportunity, for being part of this group and sharing views and getting to know about data protection and privacy. One of the things that Okuda-san had said was that she was feeling sad that this webinar series is coming to an end. But I think that provides you an opportunity to start a new series. I mean, with evolving technologies and new business processes also coming in place, and new products and services being offered, you will find that there are challenges across the spectrum, that are there and that require to be addressed, and for platforms to be available for people to share ideas and then take all the agendas forward. So I think one thing good about it is that you have an opportunity to start a new series. And now that we also have a regional office that we're talking about, I think the regional office also could be tasked with having a much deeper and wider engagement on all these topics. So with these preliminary remarks, I would like to get back to the topic that we're discussing. I'm going to quote from, we had a non-personal, we have a personal data protection bill that was created, and then it was submitted to the Parliament. And that personal data protection bill also got drafted after wide-ranging consultations, and a committee had been constituted which had drafted the bill and then submitted it. It had gone to a consultative committee in the Parliament. Parallelly, there was also a committee that looked at non-personal data, headed by Mr. Krish Gopalakrishnan, and that committee had also submitted a draft or draft of recommendations that should go into a non-personal data bill. Both of them are works in progress and under consideration. And initial thoughts were that we should have a separate personal data protection bill, and the non-personal data should be dealt separately. But there's a thinking that seems to be emerging that when we're talking of data, let us not separate them, because when you talk of non-personal data also, there's an element of anonymization that happens with data, and that brings it into the non-personal field. So there's a linkage there. And you're also talking of, when you talk of personal data, you could also talk of community data, and there's a personal element in that community data that comes about. So there are certain commonalities between what is deemed to be non-personal data and what is personal data. And there's a thought that maybe both of them should be combined together, and we have one bill and a law that subsequently comes out of it that talks of data protection per se, including personal and non-personal data. So that is the status in the country currently. And both the documents, the personal data protection bill draft and the non-personal data recommendations that have come from the Krish Gopalakrishnan committee, are public documents available for viewing by anybody and for providing comments appropriately as and when they are asked for. So, one of the things is why is the data so important is that, and I'm quoting from some of these reports, that in the current year you would have nearly around 100 zettabytes of data that will be generated. And this is only going to further increase. You look at the broadband penetration in bulk of the undeveloped or the developing world, you'll find that it's not at par with some of the Western countries. And as this broadband penetration really, and you will find that broadband for all is a slogan, a motto that most of the countries have adopted. And they're coming up with schemes for doing that, including fiscal incentives in terms of funding from the universal service funds, or and also looking at appropriate technologies and appropriate implementation mechanisms in terms of other players other than the regular telecom service provider licensees who can provide broadband services to broad base it, and then quickly roll out broadband for all. And as you find that the broadband access increases, you will find that the generation of data would tremendously increase. And of course, there are also challenges that would come about. When you talk of data protection and all, you would also get on board many people who wouldn't be aware of the rights that they have towards the data that they generate. So that is that's an issue that would be there. That how do we spread awareness and spread capacity building among all of these persons who currently are also on the digital platforms, and who would also be coming onto the digital platforms. So they are aware of the rights to the data that they have, and how do they actually manage the consent at a fine-grained level for the multiple applications that would be there. It is not that apply consent, broad-based consent, yes, no, but you would find that as you go ahead, you would have to have fine-grained consent that would be there. So this is a challenge that you would find that, of course, it already exists, but then you would find that it would really increase after a particular point of time. The data economy is so big that you have multiple corporations which have more than $1 trillion market capitalizations, and these are the major corporations. They're the ones that dominate public dialogue and any talk that happens. Then you also find that the AI driven business is, I'm quoting it, it would be around $3 trillion US that would be there. And when you talk of AI-driven business, one of the aspects that comes about is the data monopoly that is, that you find happening now. And how do you democratize the access to data? That is very important part of it. So when you talk of data protection, it's not only protection of data, it's also providing, controlled access to data with proper protection of rights of people and IP also, so that the data economy really takes off, and you have democratization so that we have multiple players who could use the data and then provide solutions and products on that. And for India, we are one of the top consumers and one of the top producers of data in the world. And that's why it's very important for us that, data per se, how we deal with it is important for us. And here, that is where we come about with how do you manage, how do you protect the data from unauthorized access? How do you manage the fine-grained access to that? How do you protect the privacy of the data? And how, including when you talk of protection and privacy, how do you unlock the immense economic benefits that come out about by utilizing the data? And that provides the data for good, social good. How do you leverage that for the social good? And also provide a regulatory framework and a technological platform framework that provides certainty and incentives for businesses to get into this business. So these are some of the things. And then here, when you look at it, is there no current framework? We have certain bills, that are under deliberation, and certain reports that are in deliberation. Don't we have any framework in the country that looks at data protection and privacy and protection? We do have the Information Technology Act, and you'll find that there are many provisions in that, and as amended in 2008, that provide for it. Now, the Information Technology Act, talks of there is a definition for cybersecurity there, and which talks of unauthorized access, use, disclosure, disruption, modification, or destruction of data. There's a definition for information, there's a definition for intermediary there, and there's a definition for security procedures. The section 16 specifically prescribes that security procedures and practices are prescribed there, and they also say that how they will be prescribed. But in the initial definition of in the Act itself, you'll find that privacy and data protection is not specifically defined. When you look at the initial definitions, that the privacy and data protection is not specifically defined. Though I will come to it, where subsequently you'll find there are certain sections where they talk of privacy and data protection in certain contexts. Then you'll also have provisions under section 43 for penalties and compensation, where without permission of the owner or the person in charge, access to data happens. So there are penalties for that. And the section 43A also provides for compensation for failure to protect data. And this is specifically targeted to corporate responsibility. Now, corporations, solicit data for conducting their business, and that solicitation of data should be commensurate with the purpose for which the data is being collected. So, and they have a responsibility to protect the data. And this is where we talk of, the security procedures and practices that should be there. So the section 43A provides for that. And it talks of reasonable security practices to be followed by the corporations. And it also talks of sensitive personal data and information there. Okay. Now, we have, there are offenses defined under section 66, where, there's a penalty for 3 years imprisonment or fine of 5 lakhs or both for the acts under section 43. And it talks of dishonestly receiving stolen computer resource, 66B, or 66C talks of identity theft, 66D talks of impersonation, 66E talks of violation of privacy. But here, when you talk of violation of privacy, it is a very narrow definition of image of the private area of any person. It's actually having a sexual context in that. Basically, if you transmit the image of the privacy or private parts of a individual, that is it talks about. It doesn't talk of the privacy per se that we generally understand. There is a definition of under for cyber terrorism also, where you have unauthorized access, where there is a provision for life imprisonment. Then the section 72 provides for penalty for breach of confidentiality and privacy, and 72A provides for disclosure of information and breach of lawful control. So here the 72A is about, even when we have provide lawful access to data, and the data then is shared for other purpose other than for the lawful access for which it is done, then there's a penalty for that law enforcement authority who is actually taking the lawful access, but not, he has actually used it for purposes beyond that. And the section 75 provides that these offenses apply to whatever or contravention is committed outside India also, if it involves a computer resource or system or network which is located in India. So you find that there are provisions in the existing Act that, if leveraged adequately, could provide an element of protection for the data and ensure security, protection of the data and privacy of the data. And under this Act also, you find that the information technology, reasonable security practices and procedures and sensitive personal data or information rules 2011 have been formulated. Where there we have talked about sensitive personal data. They talked of passwords, financial information, physical or physiological mental health conditions, sexual orientation, medical records, biometric records. So there's a definition of what is sensitive personal data. And it also prescribes that the organization should have a policy for privacy and disclosure of information. So it means the rules prescribe that organizations which are collecting the data should have a policy regarding the privacy and disclosure of information, and also regarding disclosure to third parties, and what happens if the transfer of information happens to third parties, and what are the obligations on the third parties. And it also talks of reasonable security practices and refers to ISO 27001. And if any industry association have their own security practices, those security practices, those codes have to be approved and notified by the government. And there is also provision that the setup that the organization has, that should be certified, and it should be audited by an independent auditor who's approved by the central government at least once a year. and when any significant upgrade of processor computer resource happens. So you will find that there are broad-ranging provisions in the Information Technology Act which could actually be leveraged for the protection of data. In addition to this, you'll find that sectorally, you will find that some of the regulators have come up with their own stipulations regarding data protection and for ensuring privacy of the information that is there. One organization that comes to mind is the RBI, especially because lots of sensitive financial data and the data about the customers of the financial institutions is available with these organizations. They have come up with different stipulations at various points of time regarding you would be aware of the data storage in India, and audit by certain empaneled auditors is one of the things that had come about. And security payments, digital payment security controls, and for the recent ring about the card payment data that was being stored by different organizations after January 1st, or now it's up to 30th June 2022. That data has to be deleted unless you have consent from the only the actual card network and the card issuers, they can store the data, but the other organizations which have the tendency to store the data cannot do that. Similarly, in the telecom sector, you'll find that DOT has license conditions where they prescribe privacy controls and and protection of data for the data that is comes to the knowledge or collected by the service providers for the provision of services. There's also a restriction on whether the data can go out of the country. The data has to be resident in the country, and it has to be processed for their own use within the data. And one of the initiatives, big initiatives, is the Smart Cities project, where you'll find there's a lot of data that is getting generated. And one important initiative of the Ministry of Housing and Urban Affairs is the IUDX, the Indian Urban Data Exchange platform that's been created for exchange of data. Now, that's a good platform that provides that, seamlessly have exchange of data, different platforms that come in the Smart Cities project. But what about the, security of data and privacy of data? So this is one where, from our office, we recognize that's one area that requires to be addressed. And so with IISc Bangalore, we are working, and we have funded a project with IISc Bangalore for looking at aspects of secure multi-party computing, privacy preserving algorithms, and fine-grained consent management. So these are some aspects that we have asked them to look at, and then use the IUDX platform for experimenting on that to see that these aspects are looked at. Another aspect that comes to mind is the tools that are required, technical tools and regulatory tools that are required to check compliance, especially when you're talking in organizations for following privacy protection and the data protection regime. How do you check the compliance to that? And the tools are important, and that I think is for the industry is a challenge for them, that they should come up with these tools to see that this compliance is checked up. Here also I would like to mention an initiative of iSpirit, where especially for the health stack, they have come up with the health stack where they talked about consent management, especially because when we're having patient data that's migrating across different hospitals or different places where the data has to be shared between a pathological clinic to a doctor or a clinic to a place, there you have to have how the data should be shared, how the data fine-grained access is to be maintained. So it's a very important aspect, data protection and this thing. There are lots of activity that's happening, but I'll not say that it's completed. There's much more that's required to be done, and industry and the government should work together to see that we have a framework where personal data is protected, but also the data is adequately used to derive the economic benefits of the data that's getting generated. Thank you.
Chandranath, you brought in a lot of relevant and recent knowledge and information to the attendees today. You talked about the IT Act. You said the need for frameworks is extremely important and will come through in time to come with the 2 bills that are in the Parliament. I believe that a lot of what you said is actually in the works with many different sides of IoT, M2M, and corporate practices that are evolving. Smart cities, IUDX, compliance in health. Thank you very much for giving us that perspective. We are a bit behind time, so I'm going to quickly introduce Mr. Madan, who is in many ways our mentor, a man with exemplary knowledge and energy, and presently also the mentor for services and solutions in TSDSI. So without much ado, I don't think there's many people who don't know Mr. Madan, so I will just request him to give us his important highlights on the subject, and then we will wait for more user questions. So Mr. Madan, over to you, sir.
Good morning, good afternoon to everybody. Thank you, Chair. Thank you all the panelists and people in the audience. I really appreciate that I have been given time slot in this particular important event, and I'll go ahead with that. Basically, Mr. Narendranath has talked a lot about the bill, the act, and what is upcoming in India and what is happening in India. So, and he mentioned very importantly, regulatory tools and mechanisms to implement the policy. That's very important. So I am focusing in very brief presentation today on data protection and privacy, privacy protection using Privacy Policy Manager. How this is executed and implemented, and Mr. Narendranath raised a question, that is a very challenging situation. And we know already that when we accept a privacy policy, any subscriber, for example, accepts a privacy policy, he's not ready to read 20, 30, 40 pages and then say, I agree. He instantaneously agrees without knowing what is in the policy and all that. But then regulator, auditors, as Mr. Narendranath was saying, have a responsibility to do that and to go ahead with use such tools and many tools and all that, so that the policy is actually implemented and regulators and auditors from time to time can monitor what they are doing basically. Next slide, please. So the purpose is, under the upcoming data, as Mr. Narendranath mentioned, data law, data fiduciaries and processors are required to implement security safeguards that use de-identification, encryption, to steps for personal data integrity, to prevent misuse, unauthorized access, modification, disclosure or destruction of personal data, as Mr. Narendranath was mentioning. This presentation of mine will deal with, very in brief, the implementation and purpose of the privacy protection using private policy management, especially for, I am choosing especially for IoT ecosystems, as Sharad Arora said, taking cue from thought process, especially at 1M2M standardization practices in security. Next slide, please. So the privacy policy management, PPM, this is called, is a distributed authorization privacy protection architecture using M2M service subscribers privacy preference and services privacy policy. It's a personal data management, Mr. Narendranath was also saying, but could be a community data management also, based on M2M service subscribers privacy preferences, and creates access control information from policies agreed by M2M service provider, for this example, because I'm dealing with IoT and M2M in this particular case. PPM protects M2M service providers' personal data from unauthorized parties and unauthorized collection. That's very important to note. PPM may be operated by M2M service provider itself or another entity on behalf of the M2M service provider, but there have to be very huge legal interactions and signing of agreements between the entities and all that. In case M2M service provider accepted a subscriber accepted a privacy policy which indicates provision to the third party, then service provider could provide personal data to third party. But there are many regulations of this interconnection between third party and the service provider. However, if the privacy policy doesn't include provision to the third party, the service provider needs to update the privacy policy and get the M2M service subscribers' consent. And Mr. Narendranath said consent is a very important issue in whole policy management. Next, please. Next slide, please. So, what are the components of this protection? This manager, private policy manager. Privacy preference and privacy policy. Preference is subscriber preference regarding the provision of his own personal data to third parties. M2M service provider creates an M2M service subscriber's privacy preference and registers it to the privacy policy. Whatever has been agreed by the subscriber and all that, it must be registered. List of privacy attributes is also described. Privacy policy describes the required personal data to provide a service to an M2M service subscriber by a M2M service provider. An M2M service provider creates a privacy policy and registers it to the PPM, and that PPM can be always audited and gone through very clearly by the regulatory bodies and the law. Next, please. Next slide, please. So what are the functions? Major functions are consent mechanism for matching a M2M service subscriber's privacy preference with the ASP's, that is application service provider privacy policy. Functions of policy decision point, that is PDP, policy retrieval point, PRP, for distributed authorization, management of access control policy resources, and dynamic authorization system servers. These are the tools which I'm talking about. Narendranath was mentioning about it. Next, please. So, what are the entities, involved entities in the whole management ecosystem and the management architecture? These are M2M service subscriber, personal data, service delivery nodes, service nodes, delivery nodes, hosting common services entity, application service provider is an entity as in the management stack, in the policy management stack, M2M service provider, third party, and the PPM itself, the privacy policy management itself. That is also an entity in the whole architecture. Next, please. Next slide, please. So the flow in the PPM is subscribe to M2M service provider for a subscriber, subscription to a service by ASP, that is application service provider, request for personal data in hosting of the CSC. Then implementation options are that PPM itself works as a policy decision point. PPM also works as a policy retrieval point. PPM works as a dynamic authorization system server. And there is also a possibility of indirect dynamic authorization. Thank you. Next slide, please. So, if you do this implementation, you must understand the attributes. You must appreciate the attributes. And the major attribute tags by name could be who. Who's the owner, who's the reviewer, to whom it is being transferred, etc., etc. There will be 20 sub-attributes within that attribute itself. ID. What is the ID? Which is important, whether it is disclosed or not disclosed. It's a mobile number, it's a device number, it could be mail ID, anything of the person and all that. So there could be 20 attributes within the ID itself, sub-attributes. And what is to be shared, what is not to be shared, what can be shared, what strictly cannot be shared, when and what time, for what time period it is secure and all that. And after that it has to be destroyed or distracted or retained or not retained. Sample rate, what is the frequency of Mr. Narendranath was talking about periodic audits and other things and other. So sample rate, monthly, weekly, yearly, and so on, immediately, were connected. Now, whether you are in this node or that node or end node or whatever it is, where is the data processed? It must be very clear. Then why this data being transferred, to whom this data is being transferred? So there's a set of questions and answers and the management rules within that policy itself. Then talking of sharing, retention, anonymized, sharing summaries. But what means you are sharing? Whether you are sharing in person, whether you're sharing in audit, whether you are sharing through mails, whether you are sharing through broadcast, or through a particular person whom you are sharing anonymized, informing. Whom are you informing? Including the consumer, including the maybe statutory body, sometimes maybe requiring some information and all that. But that has to be stated in the policy itself and executed. Obtaining consent every time. And as Mr. Narendranath is saying, that you just give clearance that I agree to this policy or not agree to this policy, but it is containing obtaining consent for each and every activity, each and every ecosystem, each and every use case. Protection and protection level, you have to classify that this is critical, this is protection level number 1, this is protection level 2, this is protection level 3, and so on. Myself and Sharad have been talking about this 1 to 5 or 1 to 10 protection level and all that. Then age of, whether it's the age of device, whether the age of data when it was created, whether it has become after 2 years it has become defunct and other things and all that. Each of the above attribute tags to have thorough, comprehensive tabular explanations, alternatives, affirmation, yes, no, partial, subject to, and the processes and methodologies related to that. Type of entity to whom you are sharing, party, body, statutory body, government, third party, or more than one party, and reasoning why it is being shared. So these are very important attributes in that. Now, once these attributes are tagged, then you have to prepare a table of values. Values, I mean numerical values and other values and all that, parameters and subparameters. And there could be detailed explanation of values and parameters in the next column after the tag and all that. So you have to prepare a tabular sort of, it is a huge work. It may occupy so many pages of information. Tag, description and summary, full tag description, applicable remarks and notes. These are types of tables one has to create, which can be audited by the auditors and all that. Next slide, please. Thank you very much. This was just a brief presentation on what Mr. Narendranath said, how these standardization bodies are sort of, I think there was one more slide in my, I sent a revised presentation. Can you check it, please? Last slide, if it is. I thought there was one more slide. Sonia, can you check it, please? Whether the latest version 1.0. Where I had described some sort of a workflow and other things and all that.
So just give us a minute. Yeah, so just give us a minute.
Okay, thank you very much then. I think I have spread in various slides, but as Mr. Narendranath was saying, what is the tool and how it is implemented? So it's a very structured, flow consistent, and a tool which is adopted at least at 1 M2M in their security policy implementation of standards. But there could be variation in these tools. But this is a type of data which is to be retained, which is to be used, and workflow and structure of this. Thank you very much. Thank you, Sharad. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Mr. Madan. As always, you bring a lot of clarity and preciseness to the specific subject that you handle. Today, you introduced us to a policy manager, a privacy policy manager, a PPM, and you explored the role of various stakeholders and also then what are the roles of a privacy policy manager, what are the attributes, classification of data, and how to manage it so that there's more confidence. And I think with that background, first I must thank you, Mr. Madan, for your excellent presentation. Now, between Mrs. Maddens, the question answer session and I, we have half an hour if we have to catch up with the time. Unfortunately, I have a presentation, so I will try to do justice to the time. I'll try to wrap up in about 10-12 minutes and then hand it over to Mrs. Maddens and then see how many questions are on the floor. We may be 10 minutes off the clock by the time we finish. We were supposed to finish the session at 11. May I ask the host, please, to give me rights to present? Basically, I'm going to pick up from where Mr. Narendranath left, talking about frameworks, and from where Mr. Madan left, talking about the need for a component like a policy manager and how these two work together. But please bring me to the next slide. As I said, I will try to do a very quick presentation here. So we know this, we are all familiar with this, 4.67 billion active mobile internet users and 56.89% of the total global online traffic now generated from mobile internet. And I think in India, this number would probably touch 70%. And consider now that 60 gigabyte of data per year per mobile user. One of the huge challenges the subject we discussed today is going to expose the industry and the frameworks, the policymakers, is just how to go about doing this, how to go about implementing, and how to go about the pursuit of compliance on this very important subject of the privacy and protection of data. I think we also obviously acknowledge in the brief introduction that Mr. Narendranath made earlier that we are seeing the whole policy regulatory framework in more or less its infancy. I remember the time when the IT Act 2000 was rolled out. I had a role in setting up the root certification authority of this country, and I remember how the agents who were issuing certificates in the front and the users were getting used to or getting familiar with the subject. This is exactly what is going to happen now. This whole subject is going to be needing to be explored ground up, and one of a very fine report was done by TSDSI, and today I'm just going to use the remaining 5-7 minutes to actually bring awareness of the work that TSDSI has done in this area. So I'm going to pick up what is called, if you come to the next slide please, a piece of work, a body of work called Smartphone User Data and Privacy Protection, and I would very much encourage the audience to read this publicly available document produced by TSDSI. And as I said, I will explore a little bit of what it said, because a lot of what has just got said and a lot of what needs to get done is already quite nicely connected and collected in this repository of works. So the MDPP, as I will call it, I will focus on the smartphone user data. You obviously know why smartphone. It constitutes the bulk of India's data contribution and data generation and data usage. So the MDPP white paper, which was published in 2021, it establishes the importance of ensuring users' control over their private and personal data. It also looks at a technical framework such that transparency, choice, and control can be extended for sharing of personal information. And it does an analysis of the specific areas. So the MDPP thrust is in awareness and control. And what it does, this repository of works, is to deeply analyze what are the matters that one needs to be concerned about. So users' awareness becomes the first subject. As I said, 60 to 90 gigabyte of data generated every year. Which of this byte is private data and which one is not, which one is subject to control, which one is not, user's awareness of what rights he or she has, ease of understanding of what is protected and what is not. I think a lot of this very, very basic and primary work needs to get done, and the report talks about how we can make sure that the user's ease of understanding of terms and conditions, basic things, terms and conditions with which the user is enabled for using a particular service which consumes or generates data which could be private, privacy policy and settings, and then a timely, periodic, regular notification to the user about what exactly is happening to the life cycle of private data that the user has submitted or transacted in a particular application, and any updates in arrangements with third parties. So I'm transacting, let's just say, with my bank, and my bank has an arrangement with some marketing agency. Are there changes happening between the bank and that marketing agency that affect how my data is used and how it is exposed to risks or otherwise? So it examines, this report, the awareness aspect, and then it examines the other very important aspect called control. How can user and users' data be controlled for access? How is consent to be sought? How is the granularity of consent to be sought? Can I use your camera? Can I use your camera whilst you are inside a session? Or can I use your camera in any context? When you ask for camera access, you'll see most applications just blanketly asking camera access. There's granularity needed in that access. Withdrawal of consent, full visibility and control over consent. So instead of reading, my purpose here is to explore, is to evangelize, and is to present to you, audience and the panelists, the work that TSDSI report did in this regard, which I believe is very significant. So if you go to this next slide with the background that we are discussing, awareness and control, then it starts to analyze issues with important matters, like, for example, what is the agreement? How has that agreement been drafted? Is it easy to understand? Does it involve multiple users? Are there examples? Are there explanatory videos? Is the language support extended? Which is, can the reader in the first place properly read the contents inside an agreement that are published? And then it does an analysis of what it believes is the current status with how practitioners, service providers, corporates actually deal with the subject. Similar to agreements, please come to the next slide. It also deals with other important matters. And say, for example, for agreements, it actually recommends a framework. What Mr. Narendran said, we need to have new frameworks. Say, for example, it recommends that we add a non-legal, user-friendly, low verbosity conditions in addition to the legal language, because most legal language is very hard for users to understand. Most of the time they twist and turn, and the user is at the end of the day left with a very poor understanding of what exactly he or she allowed, and so on and so forth. So again, I'm not going to stay with the full recommendation here, but it does recommend a agreements related framework. Please go to the next slide. And then, aside from agreement, the report analyzed privacy policy that is used by service providers and application providers. What happens to data collection, classification? What happens to options to opt out? What is the full list of data that is collected? How do users learn about what all is being collected? And how do they get to interpret the impact of that data collection? If you go to the next slide, please. The use of data for purposes other than providing the services and features under which it was collected. How much of that is clear? The data distribution statements, association of data to a user profile, how it will be identified to a device, how to the profile, and so on and so forth. So it examines a lot of those aspects which surround how privacy policies are implemented today and how they affect the user. Please go to the next slide. And around this too, It considers a framework, again, very illustrative. The words don't matter so much, but the idea is that the framework has to have a very strong stress on user education. And actually, that's a capability development step as well, not just a framework. Focus on transparency, ease of understanding, how data is collected and stored, policies around it. So once again, without going into the details of exactly the letter that is written in the report, the spirit is one in which a framework is an area is explored, analysis is done of what exactly is going on in practice and how a framework is necessary to bring along a level of transparency, a level of confidence, and a level of compliance. Next slide, please. And most importantly, I think at the end, it breaks up candidates. It proposes candidates in two areas, in the areas of standardization and in the area of regulation and policy and laws. In terms of standardization, it recommends that standards and templates are actually rolled out for terms and conditions, privacy policy, and privacy controls, so that there is not so much option in the hands of companies, in the hands of legal eagles to twist and turn. In terms of standards and templates further, how user consent will be obtained, what will be the granularity, what will be the audit frameworks, and what will be the interfaces over which these frameworks will work. Standards for protecting data privacy. We know that there's a bill in the parliament. I'm not going to speak so much about that, but required very much for actually properly protecting user data. And the standard data privacy and protection rating system, which is, it must be possible for a third-party agency to follow a standard with which it can start rating service providers. And on the regulatory side, again, prescription of forms, fixed forms, no changes, no flexibility for consent and agreement, so that the users are not taken for a ride. Data privacy, consents, and control. Data collection, aggregation, sharing, and leaving audit trails and transparency for users to be able to view and delete data that they don't want shared. So similarly, I'll come to the last one, which I think is the penultimate one in my list here, which is grievance redressal. You might have laws, you might have regulations, but at the very start, if a user feels that his or her data has been misused, then there must be an easy to use grievance redressal mechanism, such that over time people can become aware and people can protect themselves. And of course, for that, subsequently, the cybersecurity and data breach management rules and regulations have to be laid out. So I will stop here. My purpose was to give the audience and the colleagues at ITU an indication of the work that TSDSI had performed in the area of privacy and protection of data. And with that, I will end my session, and any questions we'll try to take at the end as with others. And I will move on to introducing our last panelist today, Mrs. Sophie Maddens. Thank you very much, ma'am, for being here with us today. She's the head of Regulatory and Market Environment Division at ITU BDT, a lawyer by training, which is good because I think that is what is needed right now for simplifying things for our users. She has worked with regulatory and policy experts in telecom, ICT sectors, both in international and multicultural environments, including Asia and Middle East, Americas, Europe, and Africa. That is just about the whole world. She has managed complex private sector, government, and regional international projects and grants for national governments and their national regulatory authorities, European Commission, World Bank. I think we are talking to a highly specialized person on the panel today. So, Mrs. Maddens, you're very welcome to please deliver your presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and I apologize in advance. Highly specialized, but a little bit under the weather expert today. So if my voice goes, I do apologize if it doesn't carry too well. This has been a tremendously interesting session, and as you say, Mr. Arora, I mean, as a lawyer, it is fascinating to hear all of that. I want to take just a little step back, take it a little bit higher, and I'm going to talk about really the digital regulation for digital transformation, because all of the panelists talked about the user, the consumer. As you know, in the ITU BDT study groups, study group 1 in particular, which looks at the enabling environment, we've also addressed consumer protection. And within that context, data protection and privacy are key elements, because we do know we do want secure, resilient infrastructure for people around the world. We know that there's 2.9 billion people who have never connected to the internet, and 4.9 billion people that, although they have connected, do not necessarily have meaningful access to the internet. And all of you mentioned that need for information, awareness, sensitization. Really, we need to keep on trusting these platforms. We need to keep on trusting the use of our data. So looking at the digital transformation, if we can go to the next slide, please. Obviously, there are a number of challenges we are facing. And honing in on the regulators and the policymakers. Next slide, please. The regulators and the policymakers, as all of you said, we're playing an instrumental role in defining this new normal during the COVID crisis, in which we've been for over 2 years now. We've seen that connectivity is essential, but there are those challenges. There are those the opportunities, but also the challenges. And digital technologies have really been thrown sharply into the spotlight, including to be able to communicate with our friends, with our family, for our children to continue to be able to scholarize, to be able to do financial transactions, to be able to do shopping. So all of the above, but our data is out there, our images are out there, our life is out there. So ICTs have really moved beyond just simple communications and have become the foundation for every economic sector, and dare I say, every social interaction as well, also for business performance. So we need to make sure that these regulatory tools and processes are fit for purpose so that we can respond rapidly, yet in a considered and coherent manner. We all talk about how our regulatory frameworks need to be flexible, and we're seeing regulatory sandboxes across the world. But there needs to be that stability. And I dare to say that stability is in the transparency and the clarity of processes and procedures, especially where it comes to consumer protection and the protection of our rights, the protection of our data. So what is the impact of that regulation? So we as regulators, next slide, please. We as regulators and policymakers, we're in the driving seat right now to drive that digital ecosystem growth. Next slide, please. And we've seen that the connectivity of that digital services is really correlated with the level of advancement of the ICT's policies. So the maturity of this framework, and I'm fascinated to hear all your work on data protection and privacy, and I know that India has really been a pioneer in many legal and regulatory processes, including in licensing. When I first started way back when in the 1990s, 2000, when you came up with unified licensing. So you're pioneers. You really set the bar very high for the rest of the world. But it's hard to achieve that level playing field. So we need to build new policies and regulations, including to protect consumers and users, and in and onto the existing ones, so that we can remain relevant and we can keep that impact on the digital ecosystem. Next slide, please. So to enhance and enable that digital transformation, we need to think about those pro-competition frameworks, the regulatory incentives, and we've heard today a number of times about stakeholder engagement, the need to include stakeholders across the sectors. We need those robust, and as you have all said, the enforceable consumer protection mechanisms, also the redress. So all of those issues need to be addressed. We need to have market-based and dynamic mechanisms for spectrum management. Spectrum management is key. And think about as well the regulatory impact assessment and dynamic collaboration amongst the regulatory authorities. Because one of the speakers before me mentioned financial services. Our data is out there. How do we get that how do we get that collaboration between financial sector and the telecom sector so that the data remains safe on the telecoms networks, but also our financial data remains safe. So as I said, I'm going to hone in on consumer protection, the privacy and data protection aspect. So if you can skip 2 slides. First, I'll start with what are digital consumers? 2 slides ahead, please. 1 more. So digital transformation is really multifaceted, creating digital products and digitizing production processes that impact advertising, distribution, e-commerce, and other transactions, and of course, data and online content and communications. So while consumer protection issues remain relevant, such as safeguarding the public against fraud, there are new considerations, and these may require altering the regulatory approach to issues such as identity theft to keep pace with digitalization. So how is consumer protection? How do we care about digital consumers? Digital services are essential. Digitalization transforms all the sectors, and we need to think about prosumers as well and address the prosumers. So as essential services, consumers must rely on digital platforms, products, and services for work, education, health, transportation, and social connections. And these include measures to ensure consumer choice in newly linked digital markets and addressing prosumption in which people are both producers and consumers of user-generated content and able to interact directly on two-sided platforms. So the new range of services bring new challenges and new risks and corresponding needs for consumer empowerment and consumer protection. So if we stay on this slide, the consumer empowerment, consumers share power in shaping the markets in the digital area, but only if they're empowered. Thus, collaborative regulation under what we call the 5th generation of regulation is crucial to effectively center consumers in digital regulation. So regulators must ensure access and affordability of essential services. We also need outcome-based regulation to consider actual experiences. We need better understanding of consumer behaviors, and regulation must address the prosumer markets. Next slide, please. So next slide. And if you can click to see all of that. So we look at the laws that we need. We need general and special consumer protection laws. And from our analysis, we can see that most regions have large gaps in general consumer and data protection frameworks. In all regions except the Americas, countries have tended to have specific ICT consumer protection frameworks. And in all regions, the majority of ICT regulators handle consumer issues, including complaints relating to ICTs, even if there's otherwise a general consumer protection authority. So if you go to the next slide, in the shift to all online data, the past decade has seen major changes in consumer take-up and use of digital services. So we've seen the internet, especially applications, multiply the amount and type of data collection, as we've heard before. We have smart devices like CCTVs, home videos, connected vehicles capture and transmit this without people's awareness or approval or consent. And together, big data reaches powerful data processing units, which AI can use to detect patterns and match probabilistic conclusions. So many countries have adapted data protection legislation to address these issues, but the debates continue. So that's where we come to the consumer support frameworks. If we go to the next slide, as I've said, while we still have traditional issues, we may need to alter the regulatory approach to issues such as identity theft to keep pace with digitalization. And here is where we're seeing we have some examples, and in our study group 1 report, where we have Dr. Ashana Gulati as our co-rapporteur, we have some examples, some case studies of how countries have really integrated consumer protection in their institutional framework. And I will leave these slides for you to look at, and the reading materials as well. If we go to the next slide, the roles to protect and empower the digital consumers. So government really drafts policies, implements rules and laws, adjudicates disputes, and enforces rules. The consumer protection groups, education institutions, and media assist with consumer education and understanding their needs. Service providers offer input on market function, complaints, and handling and consumer needs, and industry associations are involved with consumer protection codes of practice and regulations. So what's the role of ICT regulators in consumer affairs? Next slide. ICT regulators play specific roles: complaint and dispute systems, consumer-oriented website, monitoring consumer protection issues, and collaboration across the sector to ensure protection. If we go to the next slide, we see that that collaboration is needed with among the agency. There can be informal collaboration, semi-collaboration, and this can be with data protection agency, with financial sector regulators, and other such agencies. So we need that bundling of products and services from different markets is becoming a norm. And so NRAs really need to collaborate closely with other authorities. It's essential to work together to protect consumer rights, especially where markets are blurring. So that will so we really do believe in the need for that collaborative regulation. So the traditional consumer issues, next slide. If we look at them, we still are addressing, next slide, pricing, terms and conditions, and billing. That's clear. We still are addressing, next slide, consumer service, complaints, and redress. The quality of customer service is an important dimension of overall service quality. We still are addressing protecting consumers with disabilities, so persons with disabilities. Those are key, those are traditional consumer protection issues. Next slide. And while those traditional consumer protection issues remain relevant, they may still require altering the regulatory approach to issues to keep pace with digitalization. The regulatory response can no longer be symmetric, and consumer protection regulatory frameworks should be amended regularly based on the right balance between the interests of operators, service providers, and users. So if we go to the next slide, the next set of slides, this is the title slide. So if we go to the next slide, what are some of the new challenges? So we have digital communications that cut across the economic activity and transcend national boundaries. So we need to reevaluate present institutional arrangements to look at online activities and protect consumers. A fragmented approach towards regulation could be detrimental to continued growth, innovation, and dare I say inclusion. So we do need that international collaboration as well, and capacity building on various aspects of digital regulation. Next slide. Again, from our study group report, here are some of the new challenges and examples of helpful policy measures. But let me just touch upon some of them, and I know we want to conclude. So some of the new issues, next slide, are smart consumer devices. These are now commonplace, acting as phones, cameras, clocks, calculators, TVs, radios, even navigation systems. So we need to address those and the privacy and data protection related to those. Next slide. So that brings us to trust and online safety. Trust requires trustworthiness of networks, but also how the data is handled. So that consumer trust in the digital economy can be challenging, especially due to the global nature of the internet and potentially bad experiences. And let's not forget our children. Next slide. Digital identity and automated decisions. Some countries are creating central digital ID systems for official documents, like yourself in India. And digital identities can be used for automated decisions that can use AI techniques and technologies to inspect and approve or deny applications. So those efficiencies should be balanced with overreaching state power and potential for abuse or discrimination. Next slide, please. And of course, let's not forget navigating potential harms of social media. We all know that there are great opportunities in social media, but also potential harms. So how can we help consumers navigate those potentially harmful online content, be it by co-regulation or self-regulation? We need to think of platform governance, system-wide governance, online safety services, platform moderation, age-oriented safety, general user protections, and information governance. And I'm almost finished, so go to the next slide. I just want to bring your attention to our output report on question 6.1 on consumer information protection and rights, laws, regulation, economic basis, and consumer networks. And it really addresses all the issues that I've tried to address in my presentation. In the final slide, you will look at the lessons learned and the guidelines, and we have a small video which I invite you to look at after. And obviously, I'm only part of a team. So in our next slide, you have some of the resources that we have available on the BDT website. And of course, our digital regulation handbook and platform and training that is available on our website as well, and that I believe Calvin made available in the handouts. I'll leave it at this. I know I overran my time, but I just wanted to share those thoughts. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Mrs. Maddens. I think that was very interesting. As I said, having a lawyer amongst us always helps. We picked up a lot of what you just said. I think the importance of trust and confidence. Just let me check for one thing. You want us to run a video? You wanted us to run a video? Is that very long? No, it can be seen later. Thank you very much. Right, so you introduced us to the importance of trust and confidence, which I believe is the fundamental piece. What rules, regulations, and enforcement will achieve is enable that trust and confidence. And we all know that the data economy, data is the new oil. So the regulators actually do have a really hard spot and a really big responsibility to neither stop the data economy nor to allow it to run amok without enough compliance and without enough redressal mechanisms, because yes, cybersecurity and cyber hacks are a big issue right now. All right, with that, I would like to bring the curtains on the panel and turn to the question master. Do you have questions for us in the panel? I'm sorry, I forget who was question master.
Not a problem, but that would be me. Thank you very much, Chair.
Calvin, yes, thank you, Calvin. Are there questions that we?
Yes, so we have a number of questions in the chat. So let me read them first for the first two people. So for Mr. Narendranath, you have two questions. The first is, in your talk, you mentioned that security means control and manage of data. Could you please clarify by any specific regulations in India about security of data and the main issues of this regulation? Additionally, another question was about how do you promote trust with politicians to allow local institutions to store data on the cloud?
That was from Mr. Narendranath. Sir, are you able to take that question?
Yeah, can you come again? I didn't catch the question.
Calvin, can you please repeat the question?
Absolutely. The first question is about how in your talk you mentioned that security means control and management of data, and whether there's any specific regulation in India about the security of data and the main issues of this regulation. Additionally, another question was how do you promote trust with politicians to allow local institutions to store data on the cloud?
Okay. Regarding the first question, I mentioned, we have provisions in the Information Technology Act. So when for protection of data and obligations on organizations which collect the data, and they're supposed to exercise due diligence, and there are some security controls they talk about. And the audits have also been prescribed in that. So that is one that is cross-sectoral that is applicable because it's part of the act and it's applicable to all sectors. But additionally, you will find that sectorally also they have come up with certain guidelines. I mean, they are under the act. There are rules which are there, and those rules prescribe all of these which I've talked about. And in addition to that, we have sectorally, some of the sectors have come up with their own detailed guidelines about how the data is to be protected and what measures are to be taken by the entities within that sector. And the second part regarding the hosting of data on the cloud, and how do you convince the politicians?
Even yes, I didn't follow the question. Did you actually use the word politician somewhere?
Yeah, he did.
I'm not sure.
That was the question that was submitted in the chat, sir.
See, it's a question of how the cloud is evolving, and what confidence people have about the controls that the cloud service providers have about the data, access to the data, and where the data is resident. It's an evolving paradigm that is there, and you will find that it will evolve over a period of time. When you start coming up with proper controls and then have visibility about how the data is being handled, and that's when you will have. Otherwise, you will find that when you have really sensitive data, people will not be willing to put it outside their premises. They would like to have the data on-prem.
Yep.
Thank you very much, sir. If the chair allows me. Sorry, if the chair allows me, may I continue reading the other questions for the other panelists?
Yes, Calvin, continue, please. And I just wanted to add that in addition to the controls that Mr. Narendra talked about, the DOT in India has requested and TSDSI has prepared, which is likely to become what is a technical report today could become a normative standard, is about how cloud service providers should act in discharging their deliverables. So some of that might in time to come become quite effective. But Calvin, please continue on with your reading of the next question.
Thank you very much, Chair. And thank you very much, Mr. Narendranath, for the kind response to the first two questions. The next question is for Sophie, and it is about how can the ITU work with regulatory authorities in the Pacific Island countries to improve data protection and privacy laws and enforcement? And additionally, what are operational modalities to tap into such assistance? Additionally, there's another question about a request for a model for small-scale economies, especially with competition and access to services.
Is the questioner? Yeah, please continue. Please continue.
Thank you very much, Calvin. And unfortunately, I do not believe that Atsuko is still with us. But how can ITU work with the regulatory authorities in the Pacific Islands on data protection and privacy? Well, we have, and how can you tap into such assistance or indeed into such support? I did mention, and in the handbook, you will see that we do have our digital regulation handbook and platform. The issues of privacy and data protection are indeed addressed in that digital regulation handbook and platform. And we will be launching a digital regulation training, possibly in the fourth quarter of this year, that will look at those particular issues as well. So I do urge you to look at the digital regulation handbook and platform, because that does include a good amount of work on those particular issues. I also mentioned our study groups. So obviously the study group report, in particular on question 6.1, study groups are there and the reports are there for members by members. And therefore I would urge you to really be involved in the study groups, particularly in the next study group session or the next period, so that you may benefit from those discussions and those contributions and inputs in relating to our study group questions. How to tap into direct assistance? Well, there you do need to address our regional office. So any requests for assistance go through our regional office, and they can then, according to our available resources or resources to be raised, their direct assistance can be agreed on. I hope that responds to the questions.
Thank you, Mrs. Maddens. Calvin, you have more?
Yes, so let me, in the interest of time, let me read the final questions all together, and let me address them to all the panelists in case anyone would like to respond to them. So the first question is about regarding regulatory mechanisms. Do you think that an independent council should be established to solve disputes or to control and field practice consistencies by the authority? And does India have such an independent council? The other question would be, how do you infuse more trust among the users when the internet is centralized and dominated by a few big players? So may I invite this to be open to all the speakers?
So would there be someone in particular who wants to, Mr. Nath, Mr. Madan, would you like to offer a view? An independent regulatory authority as one question I heard, and then how to build user confidence in a world where the internet is dominated by a few large players. I think those were the two questions.
So Nath is the best person to answer in sitting in that position.
Yeah, okay. The act actually is the draft, the bill, as actually providing for a data protection authority. And so I think let's see how it comes about. But there is a thinking that we should have a separate authority for data protection. That is in addition to the telecom regulatory authority that we have. There's a provision for that. And the second was what? How do you ensure confidence? Okay.
Confidence of the user in a world of internet where there are some few large players. I think, yeah.
You will find across the world, especially you would find that there are some initiatives that are happening in the European Union and some of the European countries about, and even in India, for example, in dealing with these big players about how they handle user data. So there would be actually the regulators and the governments would be looking at that aspect very much, and they are looking at it. And so there would be a requirement for the governments to play a role to ensure that the data protection happens, and there's an element of trust. So a couple of things that they would be looking at is transparency and about how the data is being handled.
Yes, I think to complete that story, it's back to having good frameworks which ensure transparency, which ensure a redressal mechanism, and which ensure penalties, so that there is deterrence, and then there is the aspect of the user trust. But Mrs. Maddens, did you want to add something?
Yes, of course. And while I wouldn't wish to comment on the institutional framework or within India itself, I just wanted to raise one issue relating to whether there's an independent data protection authority or not. Where there are different authorities, as I said in my presentation, where there are different authorities, it's important to think about this collaborative regulatory mechanisms, that there is at least some form of mechanism in which there is some form of discussion and collaboration taking place so that the issues can be addressed on the various levels. In terms of trust, trust in the internet, I think there I just want to add what's really important is to have your voice at the table. So there are global discussions, global fora in which these issues are being discussed. And so really to participate in the discussions. And also what's key in these issues, especially in many countries around the world, it's really the capacity building and awareness raising of regulators, policymakers, and stakeholders that are involved in these discussions. So capacity building and awareness building is key, which is why I refer you again to our digital regulation handbook and platform and training. Back to you.
Thank you, Mrs. Maddens. I have a feeling that there could be more interesting questions, but also that we have to keep an eye on the clock. So I would actually recommend that we wrap up, and if Calvin, there are more questions, then maybe they can distribute it to ITU and TSDSI for a subsequent response. Is that acceptable?
Yes, sir, that is acceptable. And there are no more questions in the chat, actually, so this is perfect timing.
Thank you, Calvin. Okay, so that brings us to the close of an extremely interesting webinar, and I must thank ITU, must thank DOT, TSDSI for bringing such a good, nice panel together. In a quick summary of what happened today, we started out with Mr. Naren Nath describing what is the current status with the data protection bill, the personal data, non-personal data aspects. He described the need for frameworks. He also suggested that the IT Act 2000 does give a starting point. It does not address some important definitions. For example, privacy of data is not defined and needs to be defined in time to come. He described some of the specific sections, clauses of the IT Act that are still relevant, both for enforcement and for building confidence. And then we had a very interesting session from Mr. Madan, who introduced the concept of a privacy policy manager, PPM. What are the stakeholders, what are the roles, and detailed out the attributes, classification of data, etc. I introduced you to a little bit of a report. Could you please mute? Organizers. Thank you. I helped you explore a little bit of the work that was done by TSDSI in its endeavor to look at data protection and privacy in the mobile or smartphone transactions, and how the report first analyzes and then recommends frameworks, policies, regulations that are important to protect user data and to build confidence, which is the main thing here. And then we had Mrs. Maddens bringing in an extremely interesting global perspective and re-emphasizing the importance of trust and confidence. The fact that regulatory bodies and policymakers are right up front there now in the post-COVID world to create and enable the ecosystems such that the data economy can move forward without the overhang of misuse of data. And she introduced India as a pioneer with the unified licenses and said that she is waiting to see how India would respond with the data privacy protection. She spoke about the importance of consumer empowerment and protection, and she spoke about 5th generation of regulations and a collaborative framework that is needed between regulators and service providers. I would also imagine international collaboration so that there is a uniformity in how consumers get to perceive and get to be protected. And of course, digital IDs and automated decision making. And I think that in a summary gave the audience today a set of perspectives and views in how things are evolving. I'm now going to invite the chair of the DG, I apologize, the DG of TSDSI to run the rest of the proceedings, because this is also the last in the series of the ITO TSDSI DOT webinars. So over to Madam Pamela Kumar. I guess I can make a brief introduction of her. She doesn't need any. Probably one of the most well-known faces in the standardization community, both inside and outside India. She is the DG of TSDSI, Pamela Kumar, also the Bharti Chair Visiting Professor at UIET Punjab University. He took the role in 2017 and continues in the role as now with a massive amount of contribution to introducing India into the global arena with the LMLC, 5G rural broadband, and 5GI technology now fully merged into IMT 2020. She's driven the adoption of TSDSI transposed 1M2M standard, and I guess India under her pioneering leadership is pushing forth the 1M2M standards in the largest possible deployment, national standards deployment. I'm not going to read too much more. There is a lot to talk about, but I hand it over to her to make her comment in this closing webinar series. Mr. Kumar, over to you.
Yeah. Thanks, Sharad. It was a very good webinar. And thanks, Mr. Shakya, for joining. And I think, Sophie, you will also be joining us in this concluding remarks?
Yes, I will.
So, okay. So we will just, go across the table and share our thoughts. I did get a couple of slides put together, which we can just to do a quick recap of the webinar series. So this webinar series, which was called Digital Technology Innovations, Case Studies from India and the Asia Pacific region. So there were 6 sessions to this webinar. It started kicked off on the 2nd September of 2021 and ending today on the 12th May. And as you can see that we have been, quite consistent with the presentations. So the focus here was really, as we heard today again, that, this is the era of digital transformations. And through these webinar series, we have tried to showcase that in the digital transformation journey, what are those mega projects that have happened in India, starting with the digital identity project, which we spoke about in the first webinar, India Stack and India's initiatives on digital innovation, which basically talked about the digital identity project mainly. Then we talked about digital financial services, so enabling e-commerce and digital transactions in a big way in a country like India with the massive scale and the huge impact it has had on our lives and our economy. And then a little bit on fintech, a broader view of fintech coming from CRIL and IDRBT, and on digital transformation and the role of fintech beyond just the e-commerce and transactions. Then the role of standards, right, and how we've been able to make an inroad into standards and what it takes was shared. Sharad referred to the LMLC and the 5GI story from India, which has finally merged into 3GPP mainstream to enable remote and rural connectivity. So it was very clear to us, that in India that the need is for providing broadband to the people who live in the villages, not to ensure high-speed broadband on the vehicles which pass through the villages, which was the perspective of other economies, other developed economies. Whereas our need, with 70% of our population living in the villages, that was our need. And there were unique challenges in the current technologies and innovations were done in India to address that. So that was talked about and how we are influencing the IoT M2M related standards as well to ensure that the requirements for countries like ours are also incorporated in it. The next generation technologies for rural and remote areas was another session which was well attended, and you can see there was good attendance, and we had a series of people who presented various technologies, especially for rural and remote connectivity. And today's session on data protection and privacy, kicked off by Madam Atsuko Okuda and Mr. Naren Nath and Mr. Madan and chaired by Sharad. And we brought a lot of good insights on how important and what is the level of, there's still a lot to be done. I think the key takeaway from today's session is that yes, we have some framework of privacy and protection which is enabling this digital transformation, but with the impact that digital transformation is going to have on our lives, there's still a lot to be done. And I think we all need to collaborate to enable that. Next slide, please. So here are, the key outcomes are the topics which, brought in a lot of interest. Here is the summary of the topics. There's a lot of collaborations. Some discussions. Some of the countries have come forward to collaborate with us to take this discussion forward. Malaysia is there. I think there's discussions with Philippines and Thailand and also something happening with Brazil, which is not necessarily Asia Pacific, but outside in this, but has the same kind of challenges. Then we have incorporated here some kind of reactions from the questions that were asked, which are there for people to see. We won't dwell over it right now. And in the next slide, please. there's some early thoughts. So we also went across to some of the people who've been involved and have been keenly watching this series to see what could be potential next steps to this, right? This is a good foundation has been laid and a good relationship and partnership has developed with this web series. Can we take it to the next level? So one of the suggestions was that if the people who have come to these webinars and have gained insights from it, and do they want to take it to the next level? If there are countries who want to send delegations, because all of this was done virtually, we could now have physical interactions with the people who presented and with their organizations. They could tours and visits could be organized on to get them deeper awareness and understanding, and maybe then develop some kind of a way for them to pilot these in their own countries, or develop them for themselves. So this is one thought, and we would expect that ITU would help build these connects. The other thought is that let's continue this webinar series and launch another one focused more on technology development in the region. So we can work with ITU, RDF and start another, because as the digital transformation is going on across all of our countries, we feel that there's also a need for us to not just be pure consumers of technology being developed elsewhere by, we should also be an active participant in the development of the technology that is causing this transformation. So we could call it a series called the Building Blocks of Technology Development. So and we could bring in speakers who are actively engaged in some of these new areas of product development in RAN, in Open RAN, core. Management systems, network management systems, broadband broadcast convergence, E-band microwave, quantum communication, and a whole list of new technologies, new and emerging technologies, and SMEs and organizations who are involved have successfully been able to, in the last few years, develop products and bring them to market. If they could come in and see on how they have been able to penetrate into this very high barrier marketplace, and with these complex technologies, what have been the challenges and what has been the way they've surmounted this, the methods and the learning, we could start. This is one initial idea, and we are open to, as Atsuko, Madam Atsuko said, that we'll send a questionnaire and ask others for their suggestions as well. So with that, I conclude my inputs and hand it over to Mr. Shakya to provide his inputs, and then followed by Sophie. Mr. Shakya? Okay. Oh, it was in the other order. You want Sophie to go first? Okay. Sorry, I missed the order. So Sophie has already been introduced, so I need not repeat that. So Sophie, could you provide on the behalf of ITU your concluding remarks?
Thank you very much. Mr. Sharad Arora, Chair of SGSS and Co-Chair of TSDSI Outreach Committee, and ex-founder, Director of Sensorized Digital Services PVT Limited. Mr. Narendra Nath, Joint Secretary of the National Security Council Secretariat. Mr. Shakya, Deputy Director General, Satellite and International Relations, Department of Telecommunications of the Government of India. And Ms. Pamela Kumar, Director General of TSDSI. Distinguished speakers, presenters, and participants. On behalf of the Regional Director of the ITU Regional Office for Asia and the Pacific, Ms. Atsuko Okuda, I'm delighted to provide the closing remarks from ITU for the entire webinar series on digital technology innovations, case studies from India and the Asia-Pacific region. I wanted to start by highlighting the wide breadth and depth of interest in the webinar series. Not including today's webinar, we've already had over 600 people hailing from 35 countries, both inside and outside the Asia-Pacific region attending the series. We've had esteemed speakers highlighting digital technology innovations across a range of applications, including digital financial services, terrestrial and non-terrestrial connectivity, and 5G and fintech. We've been honored to be graced by the presence of high-level dignitaries, including His Excellency Secretary Emmanuel Ray from the Department of Information and Communications Technology, who provided a great elaboration on digital infrastructure and disaster response in the Philippines. Ladies and gentlemen, this joint webinar series between TSDSI and ITU, with support from the Department of Telecommunications, select ministries of Government of India, and other partners from the Asia-Pacific region, has highlighted the remarkable innovations happening both in India and the Asia-Pacific region. It has only brought to the forefront the importance of emerging technologies and how they can advance efforts to foster meaningful connectivity and close the digital divide globally. As mentioned during the opening remarks, we do not just see the closing of the webinar series as a conclusion in and of itself. Instead, we want to build on the great innovations showcased here as ITU embarks on the opening of its area office and innovation center in New Delhi, tentatively scheduled for the end of June 2022. We strongly believe that through this innovation center, we will not only be able to leverage the amazing innovations coming out of India and the Asia Pacific, but also that we can foster digital technologies to leave no one behind regionally and globally. Ladies and gentlemen, may I take this opportunity to express our sincerest thanks to Mr. Kishore Babu and Mr. Shakya from DOT for their invaluable support. I would also want to express my thanks to Ms. Pamela Kumar from TSDSI for the co-organization of the series. Additionally, may I express our gratitude to Mr. Mittal, Ms. Agarwal, Mr. Charumati P, Mr. Sharad Arora, Professor Uday Desai, and Mr. Vishnu Ram as the webinar chairs. I also wanted to express my special thanks to all the esteemed speakers who have joined us during the series. Their valuable insights have enriched each and every session and have only furthered the depth and breadth of each and every panel. May I also express our thanks to TSDSI for their profound work in the background during the entire organization of the series. None of this would have been possible without the strong work of Bindu, Shefali, Sonia, and Asif in the organizing team. Finally, may I take this opportunity to thank the Department of Telecommunications and select ministries of the Government of India for their invaluable support for the organization of this series. We greatly appreciated the collaboration and look forward to building further on this with the upcoming area office and innovation center. And may I also thank my colleague Calvin, who's been really helpful in every time that I participate in this series. Thank you again, and I look forward to continuing the great work we have conducted into the next chapter. Thank you.
I was speaking on mute. Thank you, Sophie, for those concluding remarks and for the encouragement to take this to the next level, and the appreciation of all the people involved in making this happen. And now I would like to introduce Mr. Shakya, who is the Deputy Director General, Satellite and International Relations in the Department of Telecommunications. He has also worked as a senior advisor to the ICT Authority, Government of Mauritius, and was entrusted with the additional responsibility of Executive Director of the ICT Authority. While working in DOT Government of India, he played a key role in policy formulation and regulatory framework for providing communication assistance to law enforcement agencies. He has been part of many bilateral and multilateral international delegations, dialogues of Indian government. He is a recipient of several awards for excellence in public services from public institutions, social and industrial organizations. So I would also like to say at a personal level, Mr. Shakya is a very, very high energy and proactive person. And, and he has no invitations on reaching out to anybody for making sure that the right thing happens. And he's very accessible to us whenever we need any help or guidance. His doors are always open, and he's just a phone call or a WhatsApp message away. So he's one of our exemplary government officers, and not taking away from the fact that Kishore Babu and Mr. Naren Nath also provide the same guidance and accessibility. So over to you, Mr. Shakya, for your guidance on the way forward here.
Sir, can you your headphones and plug in again, or
Asif, can you help, please? This is very important that we get to hear Mr. Shakya. Is his audio level setting, maybe there's a problem in the levels or something like that?
Maybe disconnect and join again.
can you refresh the page and rejoin just?
No, Mr. Shakya, your voice is totally garbled. We can't hear you at all. There's some setting issue in your laptop. Either you can try to restart, or somebody has to fix the audio setting. So while we wait for Mr. Shakya, Mr. Naren Nath, do you want to add something as a concluding remark?
I think I've said enough, but I think overall, if you look at the webinar series as you talked about, then yeah, I mean, it was a wide range. I mean, I haven't attended all of them, but considering that you talked about the India stack, the digital financial services, is it come back?
Good morning and good afternoon to all. I hope I am visible now.
Yeah.
Back with all your energy and strength. Good.
So let me express first of all my sincere gratitude towards the Miss Sophie from the ITU headquarters, Mr. Calvin, Miss Akuda today. She's not there, but with her leadership only we could provide the entire activities like this. It has been great opportunity for India to share our thoughts, our vision, our experience in the field of the digital transformation, which has been the key in the pandemic period being faced by all of us together. And it does provide an opportunity for all of us that whatever the good people have, they can make the life of the people better if joined together. I'm delighted that the series what has been undertaken got very high response from the member states. We received some personal appreciations, so I convey my regards and appreciation on behalf of all of them who had sent to the government. I wish to pass on it to the ITU Secretary as well as to the TSDSI and the wonderful and very knowledgeable speakers who made it possible and considerable. I'm sure as far as government is concerned, the few products or the solutions in form of the technology shared by us, say Aadhaar, the digital identity, is the one which the Indian government has declared as the digital public good, It is an off-the-shelf product. It is open source. And we from the India are willing to support and extend any kind of assistance to the needy countries in form of the technology support, in form of the training, skill development, understanding the product, understanding the regulatory framework, even at the bilateral level. I'm sure our speakers would have definitely clarified the doubts and would have replied the questions to the extent satisfaction of the participants. But despite of that, to make this happen, to take the digital identity in your countries, with the experience of having 1.3 billion digital identities operational in the country, we offer the solution and invite all the interested countries, members of the APT or ITU, to take it forward, and we will get connected to the concerned stakeholders in the ministry so that you get the due support. We would also like to convey on behalf of the government that the least development countries, the LLDCs and the small island development states, which have the difficulties in terms of finance, probably they can utilize the chain of the line of credit, which the government of India provides in some of their products. So those countries are requested to approach our embassies in their countries, or they can directly approach me. My details are available with the ITU Secretariat, APT Secretariat. I am the focal point for all the bilateral and multilateral dialogues on the telecommunication government of India. So we'll be more than happy. Similarly, on the UPI, we are wish to support, and the other products what has been shared. In addition to that, I'm sure that the learnings what India had, we shared. At the same time, if you see, we had been traditionally the users of the different technologies, way back from the Stauger step-by-step exchanges, or even if you go earlier to that, the multiple boards or the CBNM kind of the systems, number please and all, to the 3G, we had been simply users of the technologies, despite of being one of the world's most extensive market. But with the efforts taken, with the innovation approaches the government of India had followed, the policy and the regulatory support the government and the present leadership in the country provided, we could come out with the Indian standards, low cost, having coverage, and as I'm sure most of you may be aware, that led us to get 5G as one of the acceptable technologies in the ITU, which was notified by them. But despite of that, to make it happen global, we work with the 3GPP and ensure that let us not have the multiple technologies for the 5G. We are willing to compromise and come out with the acceptable and the global tech standard, which could be used to everyone. Example, how we cooperate and wish to work with all of you together and lead the humanity towards the betterment. It's not for the profit. I'm sure I would like to share the quote of our beloved Prime Minister, Mr. Narendra Modi, who says, the data is for the development, it is not for the profit. So we follow the principle and the vision of our Honorable Prime Minister that whatever technologies India has, we are willing to share, we are willing to cooperate, work together. So what we are trying to see, whatever our experience we had learned in the development, pre-standardization, in the R&D, in the startups, as India is one of the leading startup countries, we have, or the third leading country with the over 90 unicorns developed, and we have over 68,000 startup companies, and this all has happened in a very small period. So I think in terms of developing the technologies, in terms of developing this industry, India is in the nascent stage, but we would love to share our knowledge with all of you. Take you along with us, learn from your knowledges, learn from your experience. Would like to work with all of you. And in this series, as proposed by Ms. Pamela Kumar, we would like to have offline maybe 2-hour session among the ITU headquarters, the regional office of ITU at DOT with TSDSI to ensure in what manner we can further engage and get the whole world benefited with the experiences what we have, and vice versa, learn from the experiences of our learned colleagues from the different administrations and organizations, and make the world better, more happy, digitally enabled, with inclusive growth and empowerment, empowered society. I think with this, let me extend my sincere thanks again to the ITU headquarters, ITU leadership, Ms. Akuda in person, Ms. Calvin, Mr. Calvin, the regional office of the ITU, Ms. Pamela Kumar, and the all speakers which had contributed, the companies which came forward, the government entities which came forward and shared their views, and especially those all ministers who had shown their interest from the different administrations and joined the various discussions. We are really grateful to them, thankful to them, and extend our sincere gratitude and ensure the highest possible relationship with ITU as we share the common principles, as well as with the other states, making things accomplished together with all of you. With this, let me conclude and revert back to the Secretariat for further announcements, if any. Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Mr. Shakya. Right in time. We are concluding the session. Calvin, is there anything else we need to take care of before we can close the session?
No, there's nothing else, I believe, Ms. Pamela and Mr. Shakya, but my deepest thanks to everyone, especially to Ms. Pamela, Mr. Shakya, and Mr. Sharad for the closing remarks, the client closing remarks, and my deepest appreciations for everyone attending and staying with us today.
Okay.
Thank you, Calvin. Thank you, Calvin. Calvin, do we want a group photo again with all the speakers?
Yes, I believe that would be nice if possible. Let me just ask if Miss Sophie is available to turn on her video at this stage.
Asif, can we please take a group photo, please? Can we ask the other speakers also to please put on their webcams?
Yes, please. Requesting all speakers to please rejoin on the photo session.
Okay. Yeah. Ready?
Any more speaker? Let me take one photos first. Yeah, I've taken 2-3 photos already. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.